Hey guys, welcome back to the Film Frat podcast. Continuing with the Outer Limit series, Sam did an entire blog on renal labs and the renal function component of the chem panel. And man, you were not kidding around with this. You did a great job with this
blog. No, man, this stuff is pretty serious.
No,
and you know
I'm renally serious.
This is gonna go on the whole podcast, but
dude, I got a list.
This
of
was
about
one I was
most
jokes. Excited to do. I think because this one is probably maybe I don't know if it's the most misunderstood, but I feel like we put a lot of emphasis on the positive and negative charges because who doesn't want to know like about hyperkalemia because it's got these cool ECG changes, and then the bicarb with the acidoses and stuff like that, and then you get down to the renal section of it, and you're like, I don't know. What are we gonna honestly learn from this? But actually, there's a bunch of interesting stuff, and we hear all the time that got to protect the kidneys, and you got to keep them perfused. But it's like, so what? So we make a little urine, and we don't accumulate too much crap in our blood. But it goes beyond that as well.
Yeah, just reading through it, I could tell you're into it. You're into this, man. You're in, and I think that when I first became
keep going for a second. I'm going to take a drink of my coffee and just get these out of your system real quick.
Okay? I got a couple more, but when I became a paramedic, I remember I didn't go to critical care, but even after critical care, I'd look at the creatinine in my head. I'm just like, okay, if it's over 1, then I got to look up what the actual number is that it can't be over if it's 1.3 or 1.4. But as long as it was under 1, I'd be like, okay, that's fine. But I'll be honest, I did not really pay attention to the BUN. I didn't really know the components of what that was. And so reading through this blog, I'm like, man, this would have been so helpful to me when I was just getting into critical care. Because, since then I've looked this stuff up, and especially when my grandma had cirrhosis of the liver, and they started talking about how her liver wasn't able to make BUN from the ammonia and carbon dioxide. And so then I started putting it together, but I had no idea. And so you had a really good illustration. So before we get into the BUN aspect of it, of just how the kidneys work, how they filter stuff out and decide what they want to keep and what they want to get rid of. And I love the illustration of a garage sale because that is the ultimate sorting party where you're sitting there trying to figure out what you want to get rid of and what you want to keep. And so I thought maybe you could just speak to that. And, obviously people could check out the blog, but if you're just listening to this is an awesome illustration for how this whole glomerular filtration rate works.
Just say GFR.
Glomerular.
Yeah, so the GFR, glomerular filtration rate, the glomerulus, right? So I thought about it like a garage sale. So you have all this stuff inside of your garage, and I think about that like the whole serum concentration of everything, where you have all this stuff packed up in your garage, but you decide you have to get rid of some of the stuff. Now, in a garage sale, you usually only get rid of the small stuff. You have all these boxes that are sitting inside of your garage, and you start to go through all these things, and you're like, oh, that's grandma's, I got to keep that. And nope, this isn't, that's an important auntie, I got to keep that. But then you go through and you just find all this junk, right? So not only do you find all this junk, you're also like, okay, I also park my car and my riding lawnmower in my garage. Like, okay, the big stuff stays, but the little stuff is what's going to come out. We're going to filter through, and then we're going to put it up for sale. And so in the blog, I've got this picture where it's like the glomerulus, the kind of like Bowman's capsule is up against the garage. And then throughout the tables that are set out on the pavement, that's where all the filtration actually happens, where people can come up and they can buy it. And that's kind of how the kidneys work too, is we keep a lot of the large stuff inside of the actual blood. So like big plasma proteins and, red blood cells, stuff like that, they're not supposed to come into filtration. And that's that glomerular filtration rate, the GFR, essentially like how fast you're filtering this stuff, because it's got to get into that nephron in order to enter this process. And there is, a couple spots where things can come in, but that glomerular filtration rate, that GFR coming through that Bowman's capsule, that's kind of the first step, the big majority step. And there's a bunch of filters it goes through and stuff. But that's kind of the the general gist of how those kidneys work. It's like take all the small stuff out and then keep the stuff that you want. Don't keep the stuff you want to get rid of. And I used a secondary illustration just a little bit after that included you. Did you see that for Brittany? I also found a little cartoon character with overalls.
I
Do you
saw
notice?
that. Yeah.
Yeah. So she's got the overalls. You're in the middle, and then I had Brian in there being the bad kid. So when we think about why we specifically look at creatinine, why we look at blood urea nitrogen, and I should point out too that you can't call it bun.
You've mentioned that before too.
I don't know why that is, but
I think
it's
somebody
equivalent.
I think somebody must have gotten made fun of or something at some point.
And it's just
Because
gone
it's stuck in
viral
your
now.
head, dude. You must have
Yeah,
called it bun when you were like just getting into this, and then somebody just ripped you a new one.
I think, yeah, it's like getting corrected for saying stat, like the O2 stats. And so
Yeah.
you have these two renal values that you're looking at, and you're kind of wondering, of all the stuff that's floating around in the bloodstream, why is it that we consider the creatinine and the blood urea nitrogen to be, the renal values, and in conjunction with the glomerular filtration? But when we're looking at a chem panel, we're looking at the BUN and the creat. And I think about it like having kids. I don't have kids, but I guess this illustration makes sense to you. In my head, it makes sense. So you got one kid and their job is to vacuum, one kid their job is to dust, and then one kid their job is to take out the trash. You come home and the place is dusted and the place is vacuumed, looks really good, but the garbage is just overflowing. And so whose fault is it? Well, whoever's job it was to take out that trash, that's the kid that you're looking at like, okay, we told you to do this before we came home. Why didn't you do this? That's kind of like the kidneys, where their job is to take out this trash, and it's very specific trash. It's mostly this blood urea nitrogen and this creatinine. And so if that's still around when you check the bloodstream, the kidney, there's something going on with the kidneys, whether that be before, in, or after the kidneys. There's something going on there. And when we talk about BUN creat ratio, you can pinpoint a little bit. There's some error in there, but in general you can point towards a certain direction and say like, okay, this is because the kidneys aren't being perfused, or this is because there's something wrong inside the kidney, or maybe it's just urine waste can't leave for some reason. And so that's that BUN creat ratio that we talk about.
Yeah, and what's interesting is you need a certain amount of pressure and oncotic pressure just for that filtration to take place. And so we constantly hear people talking
Yeah.
about keeping your MAP at 65 or higher. Some people say 60 or 65. And that's just so you can enter into that filtration process. But the kidneys and the brain are really like the only organs that auto-regulate as well. So if somebody has hypertension, they may require a higher blood pressure in order to filter those kidneys. And it's interesting because high blood pressure can be just as deleterious to the nephrons as well because of just the damage that can cause to Bowman's capsule when you have a high blood pressure.
Mhm.
But knowing, okay, if my blood pressure drops below, 50, it's in the 40s, I don't have enough pressure to even filter that stuff out. And so that's where we start talking about pre-renal, intra-renal, and then post-renal failure. So let's start off, before we get into the ratios, let's talk about BUN. So how is BUN, blood urea nitrogen, how is that created? Is it just a breakdown of proteins or muscles? What is that?
Yeah, that's essentially where it starts. So you have, anytime you're breaking down protein in the body, whenever we break something down, there's generally a byproduct that isn't, so we lyse stuff, we cut it down to size, and proteins are just shapes. Like, that's one thing that you learn about in biology, is that form always follows, or function always follows form. So because it's shaped this way, it goes and it causes this effect. And that's the same thing with our proteins. We shape them, and then we have some stuff left over, which is ammonia. And so we're breaking down proteins, we get these little ammonia molecules, and obviously, like, just by the name of it, and when we usually talk about ammonia, it's not something that you want floating around like crazy. And so you get all this ammonia from protein breakdown, and the liver has to take care of that. So essentially the liver comes in and it converts that ammonia over to blood urea nitrogen, which is not as neurotoxic. It's not as toxic to the body. And so it's kind of this in between, I guess, like a temporizing step with the blood urea nitrogen, where it's like, okay, we definitely don't want ammonia. So send it off to the liver, and the liver then turns that into blood urea nitrogen, not as toxic. And then pretty quickly the body knows like this isn't going to stick around forever. Let's just send this down to the kidneys, and they're going to pee it out. But we do maintain a little bit of it. About 50% gets reabsorbed. So that's a really interesting thing about blood urea nitrogen is that it's one of those things that is involved in our serum osmolality, and so it's got a lot of water pull, and so sodium, blood urea nitrogen, and glucose are all involved in that serum osmolality. And so we actually, when it goes into Bowman's cap, it gets processed through the nephron. In that first little jet off of the Bowman's capsule, that proximal convoluted tubule, the very first little tube it goes through, we reabsorb about 50% of it. Which, even though it seems weird because it's a waste product, but it probably has a lot to do with fluid balance and water balance. But that's pretty interesting that even though it's a waste product, we reabsorb a ton of that immediately after filtration, and the body's supposed to keep this kind of tight control of it.
Yeah, that is super interesting. And there's also situations in different sodium imbalances where they'll actually give exogenous urea. They have I think the brand is it's called like URENA, and they'll give that as well to increase that serum Oz in that pool. So I think that's super interesting that if the liver is not converting that ammonia to BUN, well, then that's where we start getting into like the hepatic encephalopathy, because that ammonia is very hard on the brain and on the nervous system. And so if you had a patient that had a low BUN and you see that their ammonia is elevated, you're like, okay, well, this is probably something to do with the liver here. But what if the patient has, let's just say you have a patient who has a elevated BUN, and we're assuming at that point that the reason that the BUN is elevated is not because of the liver, because it's doing its job, it's converting the ammonia to BUN, but it's because the kidneys aren't filtering it out. Well, there's like several places, right? So it could be like, is the blood pressure so low that you're not even getting the BUN to the kidneys? Is it something happening inside like a tubular necrosis? Or do they have like a kink in their Foley catheter and they're not able to get it out? How do you start to tease out where that problem is?
Yeah, so that'll be when we look at the BUN to creat ratio, and everything is relative when you look at the BUN and the creat, because the BUN could be really high, and you're like, whoa, it's a huge blood urea nitrogen. But then you look at the creatinine, and it starts to come into context, and that's what'll give you a clue if it's hypoperfusion. Usually in hypoperfusion, the blood urea nitrogen is pretty high, much higher than the creat. Intra-renal failure, it could be low, probably because, like you said, that acute tubular necrosis, that ATN, maybe isn't allowing it as much to reabsorb because there's something wrong with the tubules. And then in post-renal failure, like when we talk about, we're not excreting anything, everything kind of backs up equally. And so that could be really high, because imagine you just don't pee at all. Well, the liver's still working, and so all this stuff is backing up. And so it could be any one of those things. I think one thing that's interesting, going back to that serum Oz, I was just thinking about this, is that anytime you alter a serum Oz, any one of those things, you can get fluid shift problems. So I do this talk for the live section of the refresher, and it's called Living de Vida Loca, like DaVita Dialysis. And so we talk about all these dialysis emergencies, and one of them is this thing called dialysis disequilibrium syndrome. And so this is where you have a really high blood urea nitrogen, and they don't adjust the dialysis appropriately, and so they take off way too much too quickly. And so that's the same as, because it's part of that serum Oz, it's just like lowering a glucose too quickly, where you get cerebral edema and possibly altered mental status and increased ICP and stuff. The same thing can happen with sodium, where let's say a kid's out playing football and they're only drinking water all day, and they dilute that sodium really quick, and then they get cerebral edema and seizures. It's interesting that all three of those things, they're all part of the serum Oz, and if you lower them too quickly, you get fluid shift with all of them. So I thought that was interesting. That usually occurs in dialysis if
they missed one.
First one. Yeah. Oh yeah. Or yeah. So they missed them. So they had the flu and they were too sick, for dialysis. That kind of patient, too sick for dialysis, and so they miss a bunch, and they come back. They put them on their regular routine, or maybe it's their first time, and so this patient was really sick in the hospital, and now all of a sudden they're giving them dialysis. And usually the fix for that is giving them something that also has a serum, I guess, a tonicity to it. So you can give them sodium bicarb, or you can give them hypertonic saline to restore that tonicity, raise their serum Oz to prevent that. It's just like when you lower a sugar too quick, you give them some more sugar. Except it's not like you said. There are blood urea nitrogen substitutes out there, but usually the most readily available thing is like some high percent saline or some sodium bicarb is pretty easy.
Let's move on to creatinine. I remember you and I think maybe you still do. We were taking creatine for a while, trying to bulk up, try to get improve our recovery process and get a little
Mhm.
bit more ATP to those muscles. What is
Mhm.
creatinine, and why do we care about that?
Yeah, so creatinine. So this is kind of interesting because this has to do with like proteins and muscles and stuff too. So you can look at a person's age, sex, muscle mass, and stuff, and it'll tell you there's a little bit, not a big difference in range, but generally, like the less muscle mass you have, the lower your baseline creatinine is, and vice versa. If you have really high muscle mass, you're generally going to have more creatinine because the body is constantly, even if you're just stationary, you're always using muscles to breathe, for your heart to function, just to roll around in bed. Like, and everybody's always using muscle. And so when that stuff has to get, it's used, it's repaired, it's broken down, whatever. One of the things that we break down is creatine, and then that sends it into creatinine. So yeah, what you were saying about the creatine. So if you, and it's, by the way, I still do take it. So if you like lift weights or something like that, and you want a little bit more, it's a very short-lived energy cycle. And so there's this stuff called phosphocreatine. And so phosphocreatine, it essentially is going to break down. It's got these extra phosphates. And so it's another thing in addition to our normal cycle where it can turn ATP into ADP, which is where we always get our energy from. So whenever we break off that phosphate from adenosine triphosphate, so 3, adenosine diphosphate, 2, when you break that thing off, that release of that phosphate is what causes that energy to occur. And so you can have this phosphocreatine system where if you take more creatine, you can get a little bit more push out of that from your muscles for a short period of time, usually about, I think it's like 10 seconds or something like that, of like extra pushing or pulling force, contraction of muscles. So if we break down a lot of muscles or whatever, there's something called an eGFR, an estimated GFR, and that just takes into account those factors that I said, where they look at what's your sex, what's your age, what's your, I think they look at BMI. There's a calculator that I put inside of the blog, and they say, okay, like here's your creatinine, here's where it should be for where you are, and that gives them an estimation of what the glomerular filtration rate is, because that creatinine should go all the way through, because not only is it really not reabsorbed anywhere in the kidneys, actually in that proximal convoluted tubule. So right after Bowman's capsule, like we said with the blood urea nitrogen, the blood urea nitrogen came in the Bowman's capsule and then got reabsorbed into the bloodstream. With creatinine, it's the opposite process where it still comes in through Bowman's capsule, but then the proximal convoluted tubule actually pulls more in, because with this one, it's not part of our serum Oz. Like, we're not really doing anything with it. So the body can just get rid of that stuff. And so there's virtually no reabsorption of that creatinine, or at least there shouldn't be. So we just push all that stuff out. And so, yeah, those are the things that it can be. I guess that's where it comes from. That's what it is. That's why we have this creatinine and creatine, and that's where it's supposed to go.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'd noticed on a few patients that have, what I believe to be like the beer drinkers potomania, where there's actually like a dilutional and absolute reduction in their sodium. Because they're retaining all that free water, they typically have like a really low sodium or a really low creatinine. And so that's one of the things I'll look at is if I'm seeing like my H&H is really diluted and like the creatinine is really diluted and their sodium is low as well. It's like, okay, this is probably more so a delusional, I say delusional, but it's really both because they're not taking in sodium either. And I was wondering, because in a pre-renal failure, your your ratio, so we're not talking actual numbers here, but your ratio of, let's say a normal BUN is 20 and a normal creatinine is 1. So you'd say you have a 20-to-1
Mm.
ratio. And like you mentioned in your blog, they don't always say the to one. You'll just see like 20 or 40 or whatever. But like normally it's a 20-to-1.
Mm.
And in a pre-renal failure where you're just not getting it, it's not the kidneys, it's not post, but it's just not getting that filtration to occur from either blood pressure, oncotic pressure,
Mm.
whatever that may be. Your BUN starts to elevate because you're not filtering it out, and because some of it's
Mm.
reabsorbing. And then you mentioned as well, it probably moves slower through the tubules or through the nephrons. But I was wondering, because you're retaining some of that BUN, that's going to start to change your serum Oz, which I would think would start to pull in free water as well.
Mm.
And so that's going to dilute your creatinine way more than it's going to, dilute your BUN. And so in my head, that's
Mm.
how I remember pre-renal failure having a really high BUN, and then the creatinine being maybe elevated, but just not as elevated as the BUN. So you're keeping that really high ratio. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think all those things must come into play because let's say that yeah, we don't have very good perfusion to the kidney in the first place. So this filtrate is coming through. It's moving pretty slow because obviously you don't have a ton of pressure feeding it. And so yeah, that blood urea nitrogen is probably going to be sitting in that proximal convoluted tubule for a pretty long time. And honestly, that's probably what you want because you want the kidney to be, this isn't the time, if you're hypotensive, the kidneys aren't stupid and they're going to start, just pouring out a bunch of urine. They're going to be thinking, okay, we got a bunch of blood urea nitrogen, sodium, all this glucose, sitting in this proximal convoluted tubule. Water is going to follow that stuff. So don't pee it out. Like bring that stuff back in. And so, yeah, you're retaining probably all the fluid that you can because obviously that's what the kidneys are going to do. They're not going to be stimulated to urinate, to produce, urine when they're in shock. But still some is leaking through. And so there may be a form of, yeah, a little bit of dilution. And then also that blood is that filtrate, those waste products, they're still going into that nephron as long as the perfusion isn't like super, super bad. So I'd imagine there's a little bit of dilution and there's probably just concentrated creatinine probably flowing through what does actually make it to the bladder, which probably isn't much.
It's interesting because this pre-renal failure is kind of like the VQ mismatch of the kidneys.
Hmm.
Like it's got the blood that's bypassing it, maybe some of it's going through, but like you think about the lungs, like everything has to go through the lungs, whether it gets oxygenated or not, but it pretty much, unless you got some weird septal malformation or whatever, you have to go through the lungs, but not everything has to go through the kidneys. It's kind of like I don't know, a
Hmm.
gift shop as you're leaving a theme park. Like you don't necessarily have to go there.
Hmm.
But you want to go there.
Yeah.
You want to go, you want to lead the people through there, but it doesn't have to. And so you can have situations where as soon as stuff starts to go wrong, it's like the kidneys seems like they get the rough end of the deal. They're like the lowest of all the important
Hmm.
organs, you got your brain and your heart up here
Hmm.
and lungs. You got these kidneys hanging out way down here. And so pre-renal failure just means you're just not getting perfusion to those kidneys. And it's just going to keep accumulating as it goes round and round and round. And maybe you're getting a little bit, but not much. All
Hmm.
right, let's move on to intra-renal.
Yeah.
Unless you got anything else with that.
No, I think that covers pre-renal failure. And I guess too, we should probably mention as we go through these. So what we were just talking about, high ratio generally associated with pre-renal failure, but these are not absolutes.
Yeah.
There can be other reasons that, the blood urination got super high for some reason, and it's not because of hypoperfusion. I go through some of those reasons in the blog. So we're going to be kind of generalized in the podcast where we say we're going to connect these with the type of renal failure according to the ratios. So yeah, high ratio, generally pre-renal failure. That's a little bit of an oversimplification, but we're just kind of going through the general rules here. And so now with intra-renal failure, something's actually wrong with the kidney itself. This one is generally associated with a low um, creatinine or BUN to creat ratio. And I should mention too that when you guys look at the kind of the fishbone diagram, or I guess like the alien diagram that I have in these things, you'll see that the blood urea nitrogen is always above the creatinine. So you can think about that kind of like a division line, because you're always dividing the BUN by the creat, and that's what's going to give you your ratio. So that's kind of like a convenient way to look at that. If you forget that, you're generally going to have that lab value on the readout, but just in case it's for some reason not there, you just divide that BUN by the creat. So yeah, in this case, intra-renal failure, you divide that BUN by the creat, and it comes out to probably below 10 or 12. So maybe it's sitting at like 8 or something like that. So, but with the pre-renal, we were thinking over 20 to 1. With this intra-renal failure, we're thinking probably below 10 to 12 to 1. So probably it's generally like an 8 or 9 or something like that.
Is that
Which
because the
means that,
BUN is elevating, or is that because the creatinine is just so high?
so yeah, it could be either one. So you could have a really high creatinine. So imagine that your blood urea nitrogen is 30. Your blood urea nitrogen is 30. That's still elevated. But then let's say that the creatinine is 3. Well, now I'm dividing 30 by 3, and I have a 10 to 1 ratio. Or I don't want to go any further into the math off the top of my head, but let's say let's say the creatinine is 6. That's easy
Yeah.
math. So then you'd have like a 5 to 1 ratio, right? So that's low ratio. So the creatinine is really elevating, but the blood urea nitrogen not so much. That can be because of a couple of reasons. The big one that people usually talk about with this is acute tubular necrosis. And I actually had a question on my FPC exam about low ratio renal failure and acute tubular necrosis. So this is like it's fair game for testing when you talk about labs. And so yeah, low ratios, that generally means intra-renal failure. I guess to make this one kind of simple, like acute tubular necrosis, there's something wrong with the tubules inside the actual nephron, and so it's not really reabsorbing very well. And so let's say that the blood urea nitrogen doesn't get reabsorbed very well in that proximal convoluted tubule, and so it goes with the creatinine through the kidneys. But there's something in general wrong with these kidneys, so it's happening very slow. So kind of the BUN isn't getting reabsorbed, and the creatinine is backing up. And so they both get elevated. Generally, you both have an elevation of both. But when you look at that ratio, the creatinine could be much higher. The other thing that you could see with that is like multi-organ failure, where let's say the liver is also involved. And so now the liver is not making blood urea nitrogen. You have an elevation in ammonia, and the creatinine is also high just because of plain old, maybe it's hypoperfusion or whatever is going wrong with it. So it could be a combination of things as well. But I would say between all of them, intra-renal failure is probably the most difficult one to understand when you get that low ratio.
Yeah, that's interesting, and we know there's certain meds that can cause it. Like Vanco can be renal toxic. Your ibuprofens and stuff like that can have some renal consequences as well.
Yeah,
Dude,
that's why we have those renal dosing antibiotics and stuff. You're like, why are we giving this so slow? Like, it's because they have renal failure, and if you send this stuff through the nephrons, it's going to shred those endothelial cells that are in there. And what can happen is those endothelial cells inside the nephrons can slough off, and they can form these things called casts
mm-hmm.
inside of the nephrons. And it's essentially like a clot inside the nephrons. And so obviously that's a problem. So everything's going to start to back up then.
I found it interesting. That's actually like the main reason why people give bicarb for crush injuries, is to prevent those casts from forming by alkalinizing the urine. Mm-hmm. Just because it has a hard time forming those if the urine is in an alkaline state. But it's not so much like, people be like, oh, you got to push the bicarb before you lift the car off of them. That's not really a thing. But maybe calcium, but not bicarb. But the bicarb does help with the renal cast from forming.
Yeah, so I think the last one then is post-renal failure. And out of all of them, I think this is the easiest to understand because it's real simple. Like you mentioned before, the Foley is clogged. You got kidney stones all over the place. There's some sort of scar tissue inside of the bladder that's covering the ureter. Or one case that I had, a guy had an enlarged prostate and he couldn't urinate, and urine is built up and built up and built up. And he ended up with post-renal failure. And he presented with crazy hyperkalemia because he just wasn't peeing out any potassium. And that was actually a really interesting case. But yeah, with this one, I think this is the easiest to understand. Nothing can leave, and so everything backs up normally. So when you have post-renal failure, the ratio is normal because everything inside the kidney is normal. The liver, the muscles, the perfusion, everything is looking pretty good, but it's just all backed up equally. And so, yeah, the BUN, the creat, they raise, but when you divide the BUN by the creat, it ends up with a number somewhere in between 10 or 12 and 20. So you're probably sitting somewhere in that 15-ish range, which they say is pretty normal for a BUN to creat. So that's usually associated with that normal ratio post-renal failure.
I remember that patient you had with the enlarged prostate, because I remember we were all wondering what you were doing in the ambulance when when you diagnosed that.
So that was that was an interesting case.
You had really good assessment.
I was just glad that we had the ultrasound gel.
Well, speaking of ultrasound, it's interesting because if you're like questioning whether that Foley is in the right spot, because have you ever seen somebody with that autonomic dysreflexia where like the Foley gets clogged?
Yeah.
And typically there's like some sort of like they're paralyzed or something like that as well. But I was thinking about this where you could easily just take the ultrasound and look at the bladder, and like, I don't know, I probably wouldn't do this because it's probably outside of your scope, or our scope or whatever. But I've heard like Farkas and those guys talk about just doing a saline push into the Foley and looking for bubbles on the ultrasound scan to make sure it's in the right spot, because sometimes it can go into like the vaginal vault or it's just in the wrong spot, or you have, like you said, scar tissue that you need to like move out of the way. But yeah, squirting a little bit of fluid in there and seeing if you can find those bubbles, or you could probably just look with the ultrasound and see it. What are you thinking? I see you smiling over there.
I was just thinking like if they had that autonomic dysreflexia where there's like a super over distended bladder and you put like another 100 mils in there, dude, and the blood pressure just goes through the roof.
999 on your pump.
Yeah, dude, the blood pressure or the heart rate just spikes through the roof, dude. You do a little saline flush, they go into VTAC.
Dude, but it's crazy. Have you ever seen when they like, so I had a patient like that one time, and it was just literally because the Foley catheter was kinked, and just unkinking it, like blood pressure, everything normalized. It was nuts, dude. Like just, they get so distended, and I don't know if it's just like their body, like they can't tell they have to pee, but like their body knows they have to pee, and it's like this most insane, like sympathetic response that they get. But yeah, you just relieve it and they clear their bladder out, and then boom, they're able to. But in that situation, it's interesting because it's like, I mean, I guess it's the same thing as post-renal failure, but it's already in the bladder, like it's already sitting there inside of a vesicle, a container. So everything else is backing up distally just because it can't get into the bladder.
Yeah. And they usually, I guess, I don't know what the statistics are on that, but with those patients, if it's been going on for a while, you can get hydronephrosis. So that might be something that you see on ultrasound, is if if the kidneys are just surrounded by a bunch of edema and stuff.
Yeah.
So, because the body wants to make that urine, but clearly if it's going into the bladder, can't get rid of it, it's going to go up the ureters and it's going to surround the kidneys and it's going to start working like crap. So
cool, man. Well, great post. I can't think of anything else really to get into, but maybe we'll think of some stuff or have some guests on that have a specialty in this area. It's definitely not somewhere that I feel like I have a ton of knowledge on, but this blog definitely helped round out some areas that were a little bit foggy for me and made sense of why the creatinine ratio, the BUN to creatinine ratio, is the way it is. So great post. What's the next series? Is this the end of it, or are we doing more? Are we doing CBC?
There's just one more. You got to sit through me. You got to sit through one more of these with me with the lab values. We're going to do glucose, man.
So just glucose.
Just glucose.
Awesome. And as always, this episode is brought to you by the Foam Frat Paramedic Online EMS Nursing All-Level Refresher Course. We got live classes that run 5 days a week, Monday through Friday at 9, 1, and 6 p.m. Central, and on Thursday at 9, 1, 5, and then on Friday just 9 and 1. So it's always running, so you can jump into any class and get your CAPC accredited instructor-led content or self-paced content as well.